So the other major kind of shock is going to be a supply shock, so something that causes short run aggregate supply to shift. And classic example would be something like an oil price increase, so that would be a negative supply shock. So all of a sudden you have this big cost increase for any firm that's using oil to produce. So that immediately shifts, we start here, immediately shifts your short run aggregate supply curve to the left and puts us into recession. This is called stagflation because you have a stagnant economy plus inflation. Again, if we interpret this as being inflation and not the price level, then you have high inflation plus a stagnant economy, as opposed to demand shock where you at least had lower inflation. So you didn't really have to worry about it too much if you had lower inflation with that negative demand shock. Um, but we do want to prevent, again, inflation from getting out of control here. So this leaves us with a bit of a problem here in terms of dealing with a supply shock, because you can kind of think of it as there's two bad things that we want to avoid, which is the drop in output, the recession, plus we want to avoid higher inflation. And we can't really use aggregate demand shifts. Or remember, our policy response is basically going to be talking about aggregate demand shifts. That leaves us with a bit of a dilemma here, because we could deal with the inflation problem by contracting, in which case you're going this way and you're making the recession, the output drop even worse. Now you could do that and eventually just wait around for the adjustment, so I didn't show all the shifts here, but you could contract here and then eventually wages will adjust downward and then shift your short run aggregate supply, and so you would end up going down to here with your new long run equilibrium. But that could be a painful long process if you were to deal with it that way. So you could deal with the inflation by contracting, or you could deal with the output drop by expanding and increase aggregate demand and get over here. But then you can see that you'd be making the inflation problem even more. I'm getting a beach ball here, but so you could do that, but again, now you're making inflation even worse, so you don't really want to necessarily do that. So you could just wait around for the self correction here. So whenever you're in recession, you could just treat it as if something puts you into recession, and regardless of the shift, you could always just wait around for this thing to adjust. So you could think of it as recession is always going to cause wages to drop, and you'll get here again. The problem might be how long that takes, but you don't really have any good policy options in this particular case, because again, if we're thinking about policy options, we're not really thinking of ways that we might use policy to shift short run aggregate supply. Policy we're generally going to think of as shifting aggregate demand. So maybe that you'd want to do some kind of partial aggregate demand increase or something and then wait for the adjustment. Usually you're not going to really see that as an option, but because usually they just want to put you through the paces of this model and say, okay, what happens if you contract? I'm over here. What happens if I expand? I'm over here. Or I could just have the self-correction. So it could be that this, say it's an oil price increase, that shock just might reverse itself, because if that sends us into recession, well, that higher oil price might not really be sustainable in a recession. So you just might get a reversal in that supply shock, or you could always think of it as the wage adjustment is going to get you back if you're in recession. So that's a negative supply shock. You could also have a positive supply shock. So something, again, if you would just want to reverse that oil price example, where a drop in oil prices. So as long as you have consumption of oil being a major factor in your economy, then an oil price decrease is going to be a positive shock. And so here we're not really going to be too worried about the fact that prices have dropped in this case, because again, it might just reverse itself. But the higher output with a usually would be a relatively small price level drop. We're not really going to be too concerned with that. So that might just reverse itself. And again, it might be just nominal. You could wait around for the nominal wage adjustment, because the fact that you're in an expansion is going to tend to push up wages. So that might cause the reversal and just get us back here. And again, the oil prices might just reverse itself. Now, if it's something like oil price, which we would assume usually in our model that that's going to be temporary, or eventually we would adjust to that anyway. But if it's something like a productivity increase, better technology, then that would also be a positive supply shock, but that could also affect the long run. So that's basically what economic growth looks like in this model. So if you're getting better technology over time, more productive over time for other reasons perhaps, then that's a long run and a short run shift. So that's what's going to allow you to produce more output. So hopefully over time, that's exactly what would be happening in this model, is that this continually shifts to the right. and we're able to produce more stuff over time. So, and whenever the long run curve shifts, your short run is also going with it. So you can see sort of the natural state of affairs would be to keep driving down the price level. Because if you think about it, the only thing that would be happening is we're producing more and more stuff. Well, if nothing else changes, that means stuff gets cheaper, right? So, but the reason why we don't normally see that is because the Fed is continuously increasing the money supply, and we haven't really talked about that yet at this point in the course. But if we also have aggregate demand shifting because of monetary policy, then that's what prevents this continually dropping price level. So if we kind of just keep up with this and just keep shifting aggregate demand along with this, then if we want to, we can just keep the price level constant as we're growing. So, or if we want to have, usually the Fed aims for a slightly increasing price level. So as long as you just increase the money supply, so you can kind of target whatever price level you want by just shifting the aggregate demand curve. But that's basically what economic growth looks like in this model.